welcome. This is Business Edge on News Central. I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun, and the headline for our conversation today: East African countries accumulate $73 billion of debt over the last decade. We'll be joined by analysts in Zambia and Kenya to break this down. This is Business Edge. We'll be wrapping things up with NC4 to watch, so do stay with us. And let's get straight into the background of this story. Now, the International Debt Statistics 2021 reports by the World Bank shows that between 2009 and 2019, countries in the East African region have increased their external borrowing by nearly 4 times, from $19.9 billion to $73.8 billion. During the period, Kenya was the biggest borrower, raising the stock of external debts from $8.5 billion to $34.2 billion. This is followed by Tanzania, whose external debts rose from $7.6 billion to $19.5 billion. Next is Uganda. The country accumulated $13.9 billion from $2.7 billion, while Rwanda moved from $1.1 billion in external debt to $6.2 billion over the past decade. Burundi, however, saw the stock of its external debt decline from $607.2 million in 2009 to $578.4 million in 2019. In the region, the report shows that in 2019, Kenya spent $3 billion in principal repayments and $1.2 billion in interest repayments, while Tanzania spent $1.1 billion and $200 million respectively. For Uganda, $166 million went into principal repayment and $115 million in interest repayment, with Rwanda spending $31.5 billion and $133.2 million respectively. Now, to discuss this, I have Chibamba Kanyama. He's an economist and former IMF Communications Advisor who's joining us from Lusaka, Zambia. We also have another guest who will be making a connection with us very quickly. Chibamba, thank you so much for joining us on Business Edge.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I hope you're able to get me.
Yes, very clearly. Thank you. So let's just start.
Fantastic.
First question. When we see this debt rising over the past decade, what are East African countries borrowing for? What is the purpose of the borrowing that we have been seeing?
Much of the borrowing, external debt borrowing, has been towards infrastructure. Now, I'm emphasizing external debt borrowings, much of it coming off China. We have had a few Euro bonds that took advantage of liberal interest rates the past 5 years. But much of this is going towards infrastructure, and a little bit of that, where it allows, gone towards financing fiscal deficits.
Okay, so it's interesting you make, we're talking about external debt here, but just quickly let me ask, what happened to borrowing internally from internal financiers, internal financial institutions? Obviously, whatever deficit there is, particularly towards infrastructure, we're seeing that financial institutions in country may not be able to meet the needs of governments in this regard. But how much are we looking at, if you say there's a pie, so 70% of the borrowing that governments are doing overall is coming outside of the countries, correct?
Yep. But the internal financing, I would say even what we call domestic borrowings, this is more or less portfolio investments from local pension houses, commercial banks, and we're also talking about international players taking advantage of opportunities locally through the government securities, such as treasury bills and government bonds.
Okay.
Now, most of the treasury bills government been issuing, most of the countries in East Africa, really is to finance the budget. The budget deficits have been quite large overall.
All right. So what window do the region's economies have for any type of debt restructuring or relief in order to mitigate the rising impact of this sovereign debt, to mitigate the possibility of even defaulting as well? So what do they have?
First of all, you have to look at the nature of the debt. Much of this debt you're talking about, you refer to high debt levels for Kenya, for Uganda and Tanzania in particular. Much of this gone towards infrastructure, and much of it was non-cash kind of debt. In other words, for the Eurobonds, the financing was not defined in terms of how the money shall be spent. So the government had the leeway where to put the money, and most of those try to invest in infrastructure and perhaps saves some of the social needs of the country, like we saw in Tanzania. But on average, what accounts for the larger chunk of the debt is Chinese debt related to infrastructure development. Here we are talking about the construction of bridges, construction of roads, road networks, construction of ports. In these, like in Kenya, talking about the ports in Mombasa, including the railway line that connects Mombasa and the other parts of East Africa. Much of that is through debt financing, and that debt financing is through China. And so when you're talking about restructuring, the difficult debt to restructure right now is Chinese debt. One, we don't know exactly how much it accounts for, how much is really being borrowed. Hardly any country can point to an actual number. This is how much is owed. Number two, most of them did not lend through the appropriate authorities. We have had cases where the signatories to the contracts were not the recommended ministers or authorities. These were perhaps Minister of Communications, Minister of Information, Minister of Rail, but these are not authorized by Parliament to
sign on behalf.
So yes, so we have had cases where some of the Chinese lenders, creditors, would wake up to the reality and say, hey, who did we lend to? Who signed the contract? And they realized it wasn't the right person. So they have had most of these contracts withdrawn and re-signed by the appropriate ministers. That is the case we have witnessed. Yeah, exactly.
I think that's a really interesting point, and also talks to a situation about transparency and accountability as well for African governments. But let me ask, you've talked about the railways and the ports. Do any of these countries, particularly with China holding so much of the external debts of so many African countries, do they stand any risk of losing these assets if they default on these loans, the ports, the railways, the other infrastructure that's being built? Is that a real consideration, a real consequence that could happen?
Somebody said that the Chinese contracts are only understood at the time of default. At the time of signing, not many people understand what they're signing themselves still. They only come to the reality that actually they committed as collateral the same infrastructure that was financed by the same debt financing, or the same debt. So it is very possible that some countries may lose some asset. It's a possibility. It is also very difficult to a certain extent to which this can happen. Why? Is because the terms of the contract, terms of the contract most times are lack transparency, like we have indicated. It is now that people are beginning to ask the serious questions. Can we lose an asset? It is very possible to lose an asset within your own country and within the context of country sovereignty. It's very possible to lose that asset, but you will not really lose that asset like they repossess it. What the Chinese have done is to ring fence in almost all the investments that they have financed, whether it's the railway infrastructure in Kenya, or whether it's television station that they finance through digital migration. They are clever. They have been able to ring fence the cash flows for a period of time. In other words, even without necessarily defaulting on an asset, the payback happens from the very word go.
Okay.
They're the ones who actually collect the money. They collect the money already, and the asset belongs to them for a period of 20 to 25 years.
All right, Chibamba, let me bring in James Mbugua here. He's also joining the conversation from Nairobi, Kenya. He's a lawyer and policy communications consultant. James, thank you so much for joining us on Business Edge.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm happy to join you.
All right, so in the prior conversation I've had with Chibamba, we've talked about the possibility of African countries, not just East African countries that have debts, particularly with China, possibly losing their national assets. We've also talked about what this debt has been for, primarily for building infrastructure. But let me ask you, James, in terms of the vulnerability of the East African countries and even the African continent at a larger scale, because we see so many countries on the continent borrowing so heavily, what is the vulnerability particularly of EAC countries and economies to default on sovereign debt, especially given what has happened with COVID-19 and how much more borrowing has happened as countries try to sort of shore up their economies and sort of find a way to reverse the effects of COVID-19? So what's the vulnerability we're looking at?
Well, the vulnerability is quite high. I know for a fact that quite a number of the countries, Kenya included, have been thinking of seeking debt relief under the G20 initiative. Some of them have opted to look at other options. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, the Bretton Woods institutions, for example, forcing, or not forcing, but encouraging Kenya to take out close to $1 billion in a debt relief facility from IMF to sort of cushion it so that it is in a better position to now seek either debt restructuring or I don't know, debt extension. So, and Kenya being the fact, Kenya having probably a better, stronger budgetary fiscal position than many of these other countries, Tanzania, Uganda, I would imagine the vulnerability is quite high. And especially when you think about the erosive effects of the COVID-19 on tax collectors that primarily are used to repay these loans, and also to imagine that perhaps a lot of those assets that have been funded with this, the infrastructure assets that have been funded by these debts are probably not working optimally. So if you're looking at a railway line or you're looking at a road, probably the amount of business it is doing is probably less than optimal to meet the debt repayment obligations. So quite high, I would say.
Okay, so let me just stay with you, James. In regards to this, do you think that life could get harder for EAC residents? Could governments look to tax citizens more in order to raise more revenue and raise money to repay these debts? Could this also, hopefully, some people might say, push governments to even look at their own spending and their own wage bill, their own burden as well? Could even governments look to cut vital areas in terms of health or education? What could this mean for the average EAC resident?
Definitely, life is about to get harder. Already been hard. I mean, for a lot of the residents of this country. I don't know if you can hear me.
I can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So, from a common sense point of view, and even now, we're just looking at the situation as it is. Life is certainly likely to get harder. It is likely, of course, the tax burden will be heavier. Governments do need to repay these loans. The soft target, obviously, is taxes, especially consumption taxes. We've had a few debt relief initiatives, perhaps on income tax, on things like capital gains tax, but a lot of increases along the consumption taxes, the VATs. You're looking at introduction of new taxes such as digital services taxes. So taxation is definitely likely to go high, and especially if you get into the conversation with some of these lenders, they want to see what are you doing on your part to, to help solve this issue. And obviously, taxation is one. Number two, they would definitely need to cut back on social spending. You're likely to see perhaps the budgets shrinking, education, probably in some areas of health. Perhaps even as they work to fight the COVID pandemic, you may see perhaps a depletion of the budget allocations for other areas, which may not be considered very vital. And of course, obviously, at the same time, you are likely to see governments look to perhaps, this is perhaps even just do away with some projects altogether that they have funded. So yeah, it's likely to get harder for the residents.
This is a good point for us to take a break right now. When we come back, we'll continue this conversation looking at the increase of external debts across the East African Economic Region. We'll get into what it means if any of these countries default. We'll also look at Burundi. On the flip side of this, Burundi's debt has actually increased. Is there anything specific that Burundi has done that others can take a page from their book? This is Business Edge. We'll continue right after this. Thank you so much for staying with us on Business Edge. Still with me on the show, I have Chibamba Kanyama, economist and former IMF Communications Advisor, and James Mbugua, lawyer and policy comms consultant. Gentlemen, thank you so much for staying with me. Now, Chibamba, let me come back to you. If we see East African countries fail to repay their external debts on time, especially when you add the consequences of the pandemic to these economies as well, what kind of consequences do you anticipate? What's the fallout that you see happening?
The first one, that it will become very difficult for future financing, because once you default, once you fail, you are getting me?
Yes, we are. Go ahead.
Yeah. Once you default on debt, your credit rating crashes. It becomes junk. And when you are rated as junk, it means, number one, it becomes difficult to access any kind of financing, especially commercial or non-concessional debt. It becomes difficult. So you fail to finance even your own fiscal deficits in your respective countries. Number two, where you are able to access this debt, whoever lends you the money now, you pay it at a premium. So you'll be paying at what we call junk status yield rates, which is very, very high, the highest you can ever think about. So it's not very good. And apart from that, the private sector equally gets affected, because if your country fails to pay back debt and gets poor credit rating, accessing financing for private businesses themselves is stressed. One, you face the potential that your creditors, your existing creditors, may want to recall that money.
Yeah.
Or they want to revise and price in that risk, because now what was initially considered a riskless asset, sovereign debt is normally considered a riskless asset, is now a risky asset. It follows suit that every private debt, therefore, becomes a highly toxic debt. So you have your creditors trying to call on private debt as well. So the consequences are there, and the long-term picture, it brings about political unrest, because the social spending gets compromised, universities get poor funding, and then you have people on the streets demonstrating.
Yeah. Okay, James, let me come to you. So even in the conversation we're having now, we're seeing that Burundi went the opposite way of basically every other country in the region. Burundi saw the stock of its external debt decline from $607.2 million in 2009 to $578.4 million in 2019. Is there anything special that Burundi is doing that could be leading to this, and something that other countries in the region and possibly across the continent might want to take a page from Burundi's book?
No, I think typically Burundi has really not been active in the debt markets. A lot of its budget is primarily funded by what we used to call the Paris Club of Donors. That is really sovereign donors or sovereign development partners. It hasn't really participated in this new, what we really may call a new asset class, the sovereign debt class, which is about, I think it's a $100 billion asset class. And Burundi really has not participated there. They've also been relatively isolated. So perhaps that has more to do, and Burundi's books are really not that easy to decipher. Quite a bit of its data is a bit sketchy. You really never have an accurate read of what is going on there. But I think that has more to do with less, perhaps, government spending than anything else.
Than anything special. Okay, so final question to both of you gentlemen, and I'll just need an answer quickly because the show is wrapping up. What do you think the measures are that these countries can take to cushion themselves from the negative effects of so much external debt and the potential of more external debt? What can these countries do to mitigate the effects? Chibamba, let me start with you very quickly. Okay, Chibamba, we can't hear you. Can you please check your... Okay, there you go. Go ahead.
They should, number one, rationalize spending, public expenditure. Spend where it's a high priority. That's number one. Number two, find avenues to increase revenues. If where possible, introduce solidarity taxes. You don't want to fall into arrears. And finally, let all these countries get under the International Monetary Fund program. I know Kenya has always arranged standby arrangements, but let it be a program this time.
All right, thank you. James, the same question to you. What can the countries do to mitigate the effects of the eternal debt?
Obviously, they're going to have to renegotiate. I think investors will have to be asked to take a shave on their expected returns for countries not to default on this. The G20 initiative, obviously, this is something that they're going to take up. Austerity measures will have to check in. I see no way around that. And lastly, perhaps you'll see probably a more nuanced or more prudential guidelines coming in as to when you come to borrowing funds. I do not think that I will see people rushing to borrow a lot more money from China. You might see a pivot towards the Western countries in terms of Africa. And lastly, you will see the United States come in heavily with its new DFC body, which is also looking to get into that space.
All right.
Obviously, again, you'll see that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A very big thank you to my guest, Chibamba Kanyama. He is economist and former IMF Communications Advisor at James Mbugua, lawyer and policy comms consultant, joining us from Lusaka, Zambia, and Nairobi, Kenya. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your time today. All right, let's get straight to NC4 to watch. These are a few stories we're keeping our eyes on. South Africa Reserve Bank keeps rates unchanged, and the Monetary Policy Committee on November 19th voted 3-2 to keep interest rates on hold. Straight to staying in South Africa now, 12J Association calls for extension of tax deductions for SMME investors. Now, Association of Asset Management Companies is calling on President Cyril Ramaphosa to reassure local investors on the future of an incentive that provides a tax deduction in exchange for investing in small, medium, and micro enterprises in selected industries. Glovo extends operations to 2 new towns across Kenya after launching in October in Uganda, and Wyclef Shemaya has been appointed CMA Chief Executive, making the appointments now more permanent. And that is, of course, it on Business Edge for this edition of the show. Thank you so much for joining us. You know our website. Head to our social media platforms to, of course, find out more business and financial stories from across the continent. Until next time, I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun.